right, chapter 20, so last chapter for exam 6. So this one is all of your blood vessels. So we've covered your blood, we've covered the heart in chapter 19. So this last one is the blood vessels. So we'll look at structures, different types of them, and then how they move around the body. So, first question on your study guide, what directions does blood travel in the arteries and veins connected to the heart in relation to each other? So, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart, and capillaries will connect your arteries and veins. So, they're in between where your arteries and veins are in the tissues area. So, this labeling of whether or not they're arteries or veins does not depend on whether the blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated. So even though in our coloring for our oxygen-rich blood usually is red, and then our blue would be considered like the deoxygenated blood, remember about our pulmonary trunk as well as the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary trunk is one of your arteries, but it carries deoxygenated blood. Your pulmonary veins, because they're coming back from the lungs, they have oxygenated blood, but they're still called a vein because they're carrying blood back to the heart. Okay, so now we're going to look at the structures within the blood vessels. So we have different layers of structure for the blood vessels, especially for your larger ones. So we have 3 different layers or tunics. We have the tunica interna, tunica media, and tunica externa. So internal is one on the inside, media is one in the middle, and tunica external is one on the outside. So for most of the function of our nutrient exchange, dealing with our tissues, that is focusing on the tunica interna. So it's the one that's going to be lining the inside of the blood vessel, so it's also exposed to the blood itself. So the tissue type for that internal lining is an endothelial layer. It is a simple squamous epithelial, so it's those flat, fried egg-looking cells. And again, it has a basement membrane just like your other epithelial tissues do. And then there's some connective tissue in that area. So with this being the one where we have our blood on the inside, it allows for the exchange of nutrients and waste. So it works as a selectively permeable barrier. So for example, with those endothelial cells, there's some gaps in them, and that allows for some of your nutrients to get out, but not your, for example, your larger blood vessels. This also internal lining can also secrete chemicals to stimulate dilation or constriction of the vessel, so adjusting the size of the vessel, so dilate to make it larger, constrict to make it smaller. So in this situation, that helps with controlling blood flow, since especially if they're the ones dealing with our nutrient drop-off and waste pickup, then blood pressure and maintaining that is a big portion of that. So your other So still with our endothelium, so there's a prostacyclin that's on the inside, and that helps to keep the inside nice and shiny and smooth. So when you get to the heart dissection that we'll do in lab, you can even see this on the inside of the heart where it's all nice, shiny, and smooth. So repels those blood cells and platelets, keep them from sticking and possibly causing a clot. And if you have an infection, there's also cell adhesion molecules. That gets those leukocytes, those white blood cells, to stick to that area so that they can eventually migrate out of the bloodstream and get to your tissue space. So the other layers, we have a tunica media layer. So these are larger veins or arteries. So the muscle type of layer, where that's going to be stimulated to cause changes in your blood vessels. And then external layer, a bunch of connective tissue, helps to anchor the vessel. So again, our blood vessels are kind of like wiring where they're just kind of loose tubes, so the connective tissue just kind of helps to anchor it in place. And depending on the size of your blood vessel, your larger vessels actually even have their own blood supply because they're too far away for the diffusion of nutrients to get to that layer. So here's some examples of our different sizes. So our larger blood vessels having thicker versions of all three of those layers. So our endothelial layer that does all our internal one that does all that different types of work with nutrient exchange and stimulating the middle layer. So our muscle layer, our media layer, which is going to be the one that's going to control the constriction or dilation of the blood vessel. So regulating the size of it. So they're the ones that's actually going to move to cause the change. And then your outside layer. So as you go into smaller size blood vessels, those layers get thinner, and then the capillaries, you're just down to the endothelial and your basement membrane. All right, let's talk about arteries. So this is the vessels that send blood away from the heart. So they have to be strong and resilient because they have higher blood pressure levels than, for example, your veins or even your capillaries. So they do have a size classification, and that's just based off of partially your thickness, but also the diameter of your blood vessel. So again, different layers that, again, like we just talked about, having their different jobs. Excuse me. So with our arteries, they will expand during systole. So this is when your ventricular muscles, so your ventricles at the bottom of the heart, are contracting, which means there's going to be higher blood pressure. So it opens, so allowing for that blood to actually just easily flow through. And then, kind of like a rubber band, they recoil, they go back down in size during diastole, during relaxation, and that helps to maintain a consistent blood pressure throughout your throughout that artery. So it's not like it fluctuates every single time you got blood going through it. So some of your biggest arteries would be like the aorta, which is the one where it's coming out of the heart. Your common carotid and subclavian, so that's the one on top of the aorta. They're going either to your neck or arm region. Pulmonary trunk going to the lungs, and then your common iliac artery, so your aorta curves upward and then goes all the way down, becoming your abdominal aorta, and then it splits to your legs, and that's the common iliac ones. So given its name because it's near the ilium of your os coxa, that big hip bone. Okay. So these are some other sizes. So our medium ones, brachial, which is arm, because you're getting into smaller regions of the body. Femoral is in the leg, so named after the femur. So brachii is your just arm term. Renal, we have the kidneys, so going to that organ, and then splenic goes to the spleen and the stomach. So it's just kind of those, since it's bypassing the stomach, might as well dump some blood there and then go to the spleen. Then you have smaller arteries, and some of these have like specialized name, like these arterioles, just a different naming to it. We do control the flow of blood out of these meta-arterioles and their little sphincters around the entrance to the capillary, and that helps to control the blood pressure as you're dealing with your nutrient and waste exchange in the tissues. Okay, so in some of your major arteries, you do have receptors in there to monitor blood pressure and chemistry. So with the information that it receives, it helps to regulate your heartbeat, your blood vessel diameter. Both of those is going to deal with your pressure as well as help to adjust your respiration because it's looking at your blood chemistry and needs to affect that. So the first one, we have our baroreceptors. These are inside our carotid artery, helping to monitor blood pressure, so allowing for that baroreflex. So if you remember from AP1, I believe it was actually chapter 1, where we talked about a negative feedback response. So as the guy gets up out of the bed and so the blood drains away from the head, that baroreceptor would detect the level of this decrease in blood pressure. So it sends that signal to the brainstem. Brainstem sends the signal to the heart to speed up and contract harder. So that's going to increase the blood flow to the brain and therefore increase its blood pressure. So helping to maintain good blood pressure, because you want to, again, making sure that you get those nutrients to your tissues, but then of course you don't want it too high, because then you start damaging your blood vessel walls and even possibly your tissues from swelling. The other type of receptor is a chemoreceptor. So they're going to monitor your blood chemistry, focusing on pH, carbon dioxide levels, and oxygen levels. So with our pH and carbon dioxide, both of them are kind of related. And again, when we get to that carbonic acid reaction, you'll see why carbon dioxide level is going to affect your pH. And then also looking for your oxygen level, so making sure that your respiratory rate is balanced with your heart rate so that you're able to maintain oxygen levels. So these receptors are located in your carotid, so going up towards the neck region, as well as just in the aorta itself. So when these chemoreceptors are causing a change in your function of your cardiovascular system, it's more so going to do so dealing with your body's pH as well as carbon dioxide levels, which affects your pH, because for your oxygen, you actually have 2 minutes of oxygen inside your blood. So after every breath, you have enough oxygen to last for 2 minutes. So it's the other two that we focus on, particularly your pH. Okay, let's look at your capillaries. Okay, so your capillaries are the blood vessels where you'll have nutrient exchange with your tissue, picking up waste from the tissue, hormones, because that's where they're circulating in your bloodstream. So with your capillaries, their structure is very simple. You just have your endothelial layer in your basement membrane. These areas of capillaries very rare in your tendons and ligaments, so thinking how they move a lot with your, like for example, just with movement and stuff, and so the possibility of them getting pinched off would be very high, so very few in those areas. Your epithelial tissue, because it receives nutrient supply from your connective tissue that's associated with it, so remember that from chapter 5. The cornea, which is the front of the eyeball, because if there was stuff there, then that would mess with your vision, so that's your front surface of the eye. And then the lens, which also light has to pass through and then get detected, so if the capillaries were there, you would not be able to get a good light signal because something would be blocking your way. So you've got 3 different types of capillaries, and it's for their different functions, and they have different what's called permeability, so how well can stuff pass in and out of those capillaries. So some of them are continuous. This is most tissues have this type, where you only have very little space for very gated type or controlled versions of getting stuff in and out your capillary. So with our capillaries, we have 3 different types. We have our continuous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and sinusoids. So the first one, the continuous. So there are tight junctions between the cells, so that helps with protecting how much can go in and out. Some stuff can easily pass through, such as glucose, the nutrient for the cells, so that's easy. Your oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily switch through. There is a muscle type of cell. There's a pericyte, that's a cell that works as a contracting protein to help to adjust your flow, making sure that you'd have good exchange between your tissues. The next one is fenestrated. So this is where you need more exchange with your blood supply to whatever tissue. So for example, in the kidneys and small intestines, where the exchange between your blood vessels and your tissues is necessary. So kidneys filter out blood, And in your small intestine, we're absorbing nutrients from whatever you've eaten. So helps with filtering out stuff from your blood supply into your tissues, like in your kidneys, or the opposite situation where it's from the tissues into the blood supply. But it's still very small molecules allowing stuff in. Now, for example, we've already covered this on our hemopoiesis, so the production of blood. So in order to get those large blood cells into the bloodstream, as well as albumin, which is your large protein molecule that helps with the thickness or viscosity of blood, that comes from our sinusoid. So this is kind of more of an open space type of capillary. So they're found in the liver, where we get our albumins, bone marrow, where we get our formed elements of the blood, so all 7 of them. And the last one is the spleen, and our spleen is kind of like a blood sponge, so it allows for plasma transfers between your blood supply and the spleen, so that helps to regulate your blood volume and blood pressure, as well as if you need more red or white blood cells, it can release them from the spleen, or the opposite situation where it can store them up. Okay, and lastly, we'll go to our veins. So going back to the heart. So with our veins, their job is just to receive blood. There's different structures that help with blood flow back towards the heart. They do have a greater capacity for blood because their job is, again, just receive the blood and help it get back towards the heart. So they'll collapse when they're empty because they just don't have the structures to do so, and that also allows them to expand easily because they lack such structure. Steady blood flow, again, you're just eventually going back towards your heart. Fairly low blood pressure because after you've gone through the capillaries with your exchange and those little small blood vessels there, your blood pressure is pretty much fairly dropped. So that's why you have specialized structures to help get it to your heart, as well as different mechanisms that will also help that. So we have different types of vein structures and names, just like we did with the arteries. Our white blood cells going from the bloodstream to our tissues will exit out the bloodstream in the postcapillary venules. So these are the smallest ones that are right outside of our capillary beds. And then again, larger sizes, more structure. Oh, go back. So this medium-sized veins, that's where we have these valves, and that prevents the black flow of blood. So that helps to keep the blood going in one direction. So once the blood has been pushed past that kind of like saloon door of those valves, then it stays in that next section. So if those valves fail to work, then that's how you end up with varicose veins. So those kind of spider veins on usually the legs, and that's typically for people who stand up a lot when they work. That happens to them. Okay, so again, getting larger and larger. There is some smooth muscle that helps with if it stretches. And then the reflex for smooth muscle is to contract, so that helps with getting it back towards the heart. All right, last thing for this video, our circulatory route. So we've already talked about this, which blood vessels go away from the heart, which one goes to the heart. So for our vessels exam, you need to know this order. So we start from the heart, and then on the vessels exam, you'll have 5 blanks for these 5 words. So we start off with arteries. These are our larger ones. Arterioles, which are smaller. Capillaries, venules, then veins. And one easy way to remember this is it kinda is in alphabetical order, except for our venules and veins are switched. But everything else is in alphabetical order. And then, so again, arteries away from the heart, veins towards the heart. So that's the order you need for the vessels lab exam. It literally is the first 5 answers on that test. So as it goes through, it's only going to pass through one bit of capillary. So again, you're just going to have your nutrient exchange and then go back. So we'll start there at the next video.